What's shaking booktube? My name's Cam. If I look or sound like today, it's because I was born like this and I'm kinda sick. Today I'm doing a review for a brand new book by the master of psychological suspense, Blake Crouch. And let me tell you folks, it's a wild ride. However, you might need a Rick and Morty level intellect to get through this one. Wubba-lubba-dub-dub. The book today is called Recursion. It's a brand new standalone novel by Blake Crouch. If the name sounds familiar, it's because I've mentioned Blake Crouch quite a lot. He's written a lot of my other all-time favorite books, including a very similar psychological sci-fi thriller, Dark Matter, which you've probably seen around other parts of booktube as well. It was pretty popular on booktube for a while there. And he also wrote the series Pines or Wayward Pines. You might even be familiar with the TV show of that. But yeah, he's written quite a lot of really good suspenseful psychological thrillers. All of the ones I just mentioned could fall into the field of sci-fi, although I'm always hesitant to mention that a book like these ones is sci-fi, because when you say that, the first thing people think of is like, aliens and spaceships and stuff, and that's just not the case. These books are sci-fi because we're talking about fictional technology that would change life as we know it. And the brilliant thing about Blake Crouch's sci-fi is that it doesn't always feel futuristic. It doesn't feel like you're suspending your disbelief that much. Recursion in particular is going to be really hard to review in full. First of all, just because it's such a f***ing... That's the nature of psychological books. They're so hard to talk about because part of what makes them so fantastic is that they are so just blah. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a spoiler-free review, and then the last part of the video will be reserved for me having a bit of a chat with spoilers, because there is a really interesting conversation to be had, like an ethical conversation to be had about the story of Recursion, but you can't do it without knowing what happens. So I'll save that for the end of the video, and I'll give you plenty of warning before I go into that. So Recursion follows two separate characters who for the most part of the story have separate storylines before they end up intertwining in a really major way, and those characters are Barry, who is a detective with the NYPD. Barry is your classic trope detective. It's one of the tropes I actually really love, and it's that he is a kind of brooding, somewhat miserable detective who doesn't work with a partner because he's got a dark past. And in this case, it's not a spoiler because it mentions it early on in the book, but his dark past is that his daughter was killed in a hit and run, and that ended up collapsing his marriage. Barry ends up getting thrust into a bit of a conspiracy as he sees it, all revolving around something called FMS, which is false memory syndrome. In this story, it's understood to be a contagious disease where people are suddenly afflicted with just memories that aren't real, that don't belong to them. God, my voice is really gonna sound in this video, isn't it? I guess his voice is kind of perfect for like an anime villain voice. You fool. I'm only using 30% of my power. Nani? And then we have Helena, who is a very gifted scientist, and her story takes place somewhat in the past, and she is integral in creating a chair or a device that is capable of replicating memories and allowing the person to relive them, and in her case, the reason she's doing that is because her mother has Alzheimer's, and she wants to basically cure Alzheimer's, or she wants to create a way that Alzheimer's victims could re-experience some memories that have been lost to them, and hopefully that would trigger some kind of neurological recovery in their brain. Obviously, nothing is as it seems. There is a lot of twists, a lot of what the fuck moments, and ultimately Barry and Helena's stories come crashing together really, really hard. But that's about all I can say without spoiling it. Normally I don't do this, but I want to read at least some of the synopsis on the back of the book because I just think it's so well written, and I think it does such a good job of enticing you for the story that I think it'll give you a good idea of what the book's about as well. What if someone else could rewrite your entire life? My son has been erased. Those are the last words the woman tells Barry Sutton before she leaps from the Manhattan rooftop. Deeply unnerved, Barry begins to investigate her death, only to learn that this wasn't an isolated case. All across the country, people are waking up to lives different from the ones they fell asleep to. Are they suffering from false memory syndrome, a mysterious new disease that afflicts people with vivid memories of a life they never lived? or is something far more sinister behind the fracturing of reality all around him? Now, how cool does that sound? Pretty cool. I should mention, as a trigger warning as well, this book does have plural, and although the book doesn't focus hard on those, they're more so mentioned in passing, they still can be quite graphic, so just know that going into it. One of the most interesting things about recursion is that it's built on the foundation of something that's a real phenomenon, which is called the Mandela effect. A lot of people watching are probably already aware of this, and it's super, super cool. But basically what the Mandela effect is that there are a whole bunch of people, just a ton of people, that adamantly believe that Nelson Mandela actually died while he was in prison decades ago. Except we know that's not actually the case. He only died in 2013, but there are so many people that just say they remember it as a vivid memory, that happening. That is kind of the basis of this whole story. Another example of the Mandela effect is the Bernstein Bears, or the Bernstein Bears. This is one I can actually relate to a bit more because I kind of have the memory of it being different to what it actually is, and that is that whether there was an E or an A in the name of the bears. There's a ton of different examples of this, and it's just extremely interesting. I would recommend going on Google and just typing in Mandela effect and having a look through all the examples, and chances are you're going to find one that applies to you. It's just really cool, kind of scary. So as for my feelings on the book Recursion, the spoiler-free review part of the video, I guess you could say, Recursion is quite easily one of the funnest and one of the very few existential roller coaster rides I've been on that I've actually enjoyed. At least recently, I've been so kind of delicate when it comes to conversations of existentialism. It just kind of threw me into a bit of a anxiety hole. But Recursion didn't do that for me. It was a really fun ride of what if. And a huge part of that is that in order to really fall into the story, you have to imagine a reality that is so different from ours, but then at the same time, perhaps it isn't. Like I said before, it doesn't feel like you're suspending your disbelief that much to really get into the book Recursion. Same thing with Dark Matter. Because truthfully, the human race, there's so much we don't know. So we can imagine scenarios like what's happening here, and it doesn't feel that unbelievable, really. Even like a full day after finishing the story, I was just kind of like... Despite starting with a really, really fantastic hook, which, as you heard from the synopsis of the story, the book actually starts with this woman up on top of the building talking about the life that she experienced but didn't actually experience. It's just such a great hook, and it really catches you just like that. But despite that, the story itself is pretty slow to really not begin, but it's slow to really get to the true excitement of the story and the true interesting questions that you would have about a situation like this. The thing is, that slow start also does feel kind of necessary because obviously we want to build a really solid foundation for the two characters involved. And when you're doing that separately rather than together, it's going to feel a bit longer. You're building the foundation for two character arcs in two separate stories, so to speak. And aside from that, it's also really important to kind of lay down a playing field for what would be considered calm and what would be considered true reality. That way, when the moments of true shit in your pants chaos erupt, you know exactly what's at stake. You know what is calm in this fictional universe, and that makes the real chaos feel all the more chaotic. But it is quite slow to start, and I imagine that's a big factor, and I'm going to guess that a lot of people have DNF'd this book like a couple of chapters in, and I kind of get it. I get it. I'm usually hard against saying just stick through it and it'll get better, because I don't think you should have to slog through sections of a book to get to the good parts. But personally, I never felt like I was slogging through anything. It just felt like I was reading through what would be the calm before the storm, and you're always more excited for the storm. And let me tell you, the storm or the chaos in this book is just exceptional, and it's terrifying, and it blows all of the chaos of Dark Matter and even Wayward Pines out of the water. I know I keep comparing Recursion to the other Blake Crouch books because they're so similar. Not necessarily in stories, but in the existential, psychological they're just so similar. But the difference is, I would say, is that Dark Matter feels like the fracturing of reality for one man or one family even, Wayward Pines feels like the fracturing of reality for one town. But recursion is the fracturing of everyone, of the whole world. It's immense. One thing I really didn't like about the story, though, it's kind of weird. I don't know if anyone else has really seen this as an issue, but the story was written in third person present tense, which is kind of odd. I'm already not the biggest fan of first person present tense, but at least it works in a way, especially with psychological books or psychological thrillers, because a big part of that is knowing what's going on inside the character's head. So it kind of makes sense to do first person. But in recursion, it's third person present tense. And unfortunately, that kind of felt really rigid at times. It almost feels like reading a screenplay at the slower points in the story, and that really does pull you out. Makes you feel a whole lot less immersed. Third person present tense, by the way, would sound a bit like Barry steps into the room. He looks around, but there's no one there. Suddenly there's a sound from the corner of the room. Barry turns around and raises his gun. It just feels a bit, I don't know. Now, the kind of explanation for the reality fuckery went in a direction that I didn't really expect, and at first, when I read it, I was just like, oh no. I really didn't like it at first, but once it got a chance to prove that it was going in a bit of a fresh and a unique direction, I started to, maybe not love it, but I started to be more okay with it, and then by the end of the story, it felt completely necessary to the narrative. So by the end of the book, I was like, okay, cool. And it never felt like an obstacle I needed to get through, but just at first, it threw me off a bit. It wasn't a direction I was expecting, and in the spoiler part of this video, I'll tell you exactly what that is. There was also a weird large portion of the book when Barry and Helena have their part of the story together, where Barry felt just like a prop or a viewing glass for the reader. He'd spent this whole story being a really kind of assertive and curious character, a detective, and then all of a sudden he's just this character where all these things are happening to him and he's just experiencing everything happening, and he just felt like little more than a peeping hole on a door for the reader to look through into the story. I didn't really like that. Another thing I didn't really like, another con I guess, would be that the resolution of the story or the ending just felt a bit too convenient. All of the, hard work or pain and all of what the protagonists had been through the book didn't really feel like it contributed to how the story was resolved. The thing that allowed the ending to happen didn't feel like it came about as a result of all the hard work and pain of the protagonists. That's what I'm trying to say. All in all, recursion will drill your brain. Not in a sexual way. I mean, unless you... Reading recursion was kind of like experiencing the, drunk existential conversations you have with your mates after a house party. I feel like people have to know what I'm talking about when I say this, but like after you get drunk and you're just kind of chilling with your mates and you're having conversations about just weird alternate versions of reality and like, what if this was the case and what if that was the case? What if you're the only real human in the whole world and everyone else is just a construct of your imagination? Stuff like that. That's not anything to do with recursion, but just situations like that. That's what recursion felt like, but as an extended narrative, and that's just awesome. With recursion, you get to question reality in such a fun and scary way because it doesn't feel like you're suspending your disbelief that far. I guess, by all means, as unbelievable as it is, a situation like what happens in recursion maybe could be kind of true. Who knows? Probably not, but, it's fun and it's scary to think about. Taking the cons into account and also thinking of the fact that I rated Dark Matter 5 stars, I don't think recursion is quite at the level of Dark Matter, and maybe that's just because Dark Matter was my first kind of exposure to Blake Crouch's f***ery, but I don't know. I don't think I can give recursion the same star rating as Dark Matter as much as I want to give it 5 stars, but also taking the cons into account, I'm going to give it 4 stars. If you're even slightly a fan of psychological thrillers, read recursion. That's all I can say. It's a great book. It's one of the only 2 books this year that I was truly hyped for, this and Full Throttle by Joe Hill. I'm excited for other books, but these are the 2 I was really hyped for, and it didn't disappoint me. Alright, now I'm going to get into the spoiler section. So if you're planning to read recursion and you don't want anything spoiled for you, this is it.
Get out of here!
Here's your warning. I'm gonna...
Go! I'm going. Go! Shit.
So this isn't really like a spoiler review of the book in this part of the video, because I feel like I've already reviewed the book in the spoiler-free part, but there are a few points of the story that I think could really be discussed and talked about, but you can only do that if you know what the big thing of the story is. And obviously, this is the thing I was referring to before when I said the story went in a direction I didn't really expect, and at first I was like, oh no, why? That thing is time travel. I thought the story would just be like, people actually creating fake memories and using those memories to manipulate people, but the false memory syndrome, as we now know, is not fake memories, just memories from a timeline that has been overwritten. So yeah, the time travel, I wasn't really expecting it. And as much as I love time travel, Back to the Future's my shit, it just has a way of taking stories in such a completely different direction every single time. So at that point, I was like, oh great, now this story is just going to become a whole like Groundhog Day kind of thing. And in a way it was, but it was still fresh enough that I enjoyed it. So I'm going to attempt to do something extremely difficult, and that is I'm going to attempt to explain how time travel works in recursion. It's by no means a difficult thing to keep track of through the story, but it can get confusing at some points. I was confused at a lot of points as far as the time travel goes, but I think I've got it all figured out, and I feel like it would just be beneficial to kind of explain it. I wish I had a whiteboard to do this, but I'm just going to use this piece of paper. So basically, the way time travel works in this story is that time is not basically linear. It's not like this is you as a kid breaking your leg. This is you as a teenager graduating high school. This is you as an adult getting married. That's not what it's like. The idea is that these are all happening at the exact same point in time, or time as we know it. The reason it feels linear is because it depends on what memory you are currently experiencing. So the idea of recursion is that they create a time machine, which is, let's just say it's a chair, because it is a chair. I'm just going to draw a box. So that's the time machine. And what the chair is capable of doing is fully immersing you, kind of like VR, but just the most perfect version of VR that you can imagine. It completely immerses you into a past memory. And because you are now experiencing that memory, you have essentially traveled through time. And what makes that work is just how completely you're immersed in that memory. And also, when you're in that time machine, it kills you at the exact point in time that you have this big DMT release in your brain. I won't go into that because that's like a whole thing you don't really need to know about, but it's just a chemical release. So you're experiencing that past memory and you're now living in that past memory. You have essentially time traveled. That's pretty easy to understand. I hope anyway. I'm probably doing a terrible job at explaining this. But what about everyone else? Normally in time travel fiction, everyone else just doesn't really matter so much. Their lives are just rewritten without any consequence whatsoever. And that's what I love about recursion, is that that's not the case. And in fact, that's the catalyst for all of the problems of the story. So, say you have person A, who is the person who will be time traveling, and person B, who, let's just say, is in the same room. Person A gets in the chair, and they travel back. It could be, 50 years, 20 years. But for the sake of this, to make it easier to understand, let's just say 1 week. They just go back 1 week. So person A goes back 1 week. Person B of 1 week ago does not know about any of the stuff that's happened because they're in the past. That makes sense. Let's say person A takes person B to a restaurant instead of the lab on the day that they would have gone back in time. At the exact same time they would have gone back in time, let's say originally person A went back in time at exactly 5 p.m. on Tuesday that week. So they go back a week, and then at 5 p.m. on Tuesday again, that is when reality catches up and everything shifts. Person B will suddenly remember that week. They will remember 2 different versions of that week. The timeline that was overwritten, the original one, is now a dead memory. And dead memories are what is considered false memory syndrome in recursion, in the story. Yeah. So basically going back to the original timeline, right? What happens to person B when person A travels in time? As soon as they are killed in the time machine, to person B, it feels like they are transported from the lab to the restaurant, and suddenly they have 2 sets of memories of the last week. That is literally the easiest way I can put that, and obviously reading the book is a much easier way of understanding how time travel works because Blake takes the time to explain that in slow segments and makes it a lot easier to understand. That's why it's so necessary for large chunks of this book to feel like it's going slow or feel like you have to push through it. It's because it's laying the foundation for making you understand this super complex concept of time travel. It's just, that's necessary. So the ethical questions that recursion raises is extremely similar to dark matter, and that's that if you had the chance to go back and change things, would you? And the problem is that the answer always seems so simple, but it's obviously not, because what a lot of people don't take into account is the consequences that this has for other people. In recursion, that happens to be everyone finding out about the chair and all of the world governments in a bit of a nuclear arms race to build the chair so that they can shape reality however they want, creating a paradoxical, chaotic loop of terrorism all around the world. It's just... These books melt your brain, but I love it. You can ask someone the ethical question of would they go back in time and change things if it meant this potential chaos for other people, and most people would probably be like, oh, no, of course I wouldn't, but we don't truly know, especially not in a situation where it's something like your daughter dying in a hit and run. I think most people would actually take the opportunity to go back and save them, even if that had the potential to result in, well, what happens in recursion, and that's it. At a point in time, the realities catch up with each other, and that dead daughter suddenly remembers dying, which is so traumatic that it drives her to suicide. Anyway, yeah, recursion lived up and surpassed my expectations. Absolutely loved it. I really do hope Blake Crouch is going to keep writing these psychological brain f***ery books, because I love them so much. What they kind of feel like, I guess, is book versions of the TV show Black Mirror. So if you know any other authors or books that fall into that category, please let me know. Right, I'm obviously very sick, so I'm going to go cry in the shower for a couple of hours. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Catch ya.